Welcome to the Reality Revolution. Today I'm reading from a fascinating book called 10 Days to a Great New Life. This is another from the Parker Publishing Pantheon, published in 1963. Copyright was never renewed. This carries a number of actionable steps that will help you to create your reality and to manifest prosperity into your life. There's some really powerful chapters. I definitely plan on returning to this several times. In researching William E. Edwards, I could not find very much, just a couple of books, most of them on wealth and prosperity. In the book jacket, it states that William E. Edwards' own life is a living proof of the power in this specific actions technique. It has led him to the richest rewards of life, success as a businessman and as a creative executive. It has made him a dynamic speaker, a successful author. It has brought him happiness as a husband and father. He has lectured widely on this technique. He counsels people on solving their personal problems, showing them how to use these electric actions to throw open the door to happy, successful living. In particular, we're reading a chapter that he writes on the powers of thinking big, and in particular, the ways that we can break through in our thinking that limits the size of our wealth, the amount of our potential prosperity. The secret to this is really to learn how to think big, and we have discussed this in particular with two previous episodes. First, how to practice the art of thinking big, which delves into Howard E. Hill's particular book, How to Think Like a Millionaire, and then the episode called Believe You Can Succeed and You Will by David Schwartz, who wrote the book The Magic of Thinking Big. There is a way that you think about the world that limits your potential prosperity. You get used to making $3,000 and you say, oh, it would be so nice if I could make $4,000 a month. When in fact, if you change the way you thought about it and said, I need to make $30,000 a month, and you 10x what it is that you want to manifest, it changes everything. It's a way of thinking that in and of itself will break through the barriers that are limiting your potentials. Edwards begins by saying the purpose of this technique is to enable you to break through the ceiling that limits the size of the thoughts you can think, that limits the size of the goals you can set up, that limits the size of the ways and means you can come up with for their realization. Here is the technique. Imagine that you're suddenly faced with the necessity of doing things on 10 times the scale that you are now operating. I can hear your impatient reply, 10 times the scale? That man's crazy. But that's just the reaction you're supposed to have. It's supposed to shock you. The whole value of this technique is in the jolt it gives. We desperately need something to shock us out of our habitual round of small-time thinking. This is no place for half measures. When we use half measures, when, for example, we tell ourselves we must do a little better, nothing is basically changed. We then go on thinking and acting in the same old size pattern. But when we use this 10 times technique, and use it right, it wakes us up like a clap of thunder. We stop short, see everything with a fresh eye, reappraise everything we are doing, dramatically change our method of operation. Thinking big sets imaginative people on fire. When I talked with a friend about this, he thought I should leave it out of the book. Here was his objection. How many people are interested in thinking big, or in being big for that matter? Almost all people want is to be a bit better off than they are. They want to move up from a Falcon to a Buick, from a $12,000 home in Levittown to $20,000 ranch house in Huntington, from $8,000 a year to $12,000 a year. Here was my answer to him. This book is being written for people who want to do something special with their lives, for people who believe they have something special inside them to which they must give expression. These people often need a big canvas on which to work. The thing that holds them back is the artificial limitation that hems in the size of the thoughts they can think. The thing that frustrates them is their inability to encompass mental concepts that are big enough for their potential capacities. Projects of real dimensions set the capabilities of such people on fire. Big thinking, when you need it, when it suits your potential, is very fiery stuff. But we don't think big. A psychologist once told me that the thoughts any person can think are limited by the culture in which he lives. Something akin to this is at work in our lives, limiting the size of the thoughts we can think. It is said that people who have never seen a mountain can't picture one. That's not precisely what keeps us from thinking big. Figuratively speaking, we have seen a mountain. We have seen and heard of other people who have done great things. The trouble is we can't think of ourselves as doing things of real dimension. We can't picture a mountain of our own. There are many factors that hold down the size of the thoughts a person can think. The portion of society from which he comes, his estimate of his own powers, what others expect of him, what he expects of himself, how deserving he feels, the amount of needling he gets from his wife, the scale on which he is now operating. All these tend to set the dimension in which he thinks. He gets thinking in a certain size pattern, and habit and inertia do the rest. Why, for example, does a man think he should try to make $12,000 a year? Because for some reason or other, $12,000 seems right and proper to him. Why shouldn't the same man think at $60,000 a year? Because it doesn't fit what he thinks should be his picture of himself. There's an actual situation that illustrates how the size of our thinking keeps us from taking success-making action, even when the door is thrown wide open to us. Some years ago, a man was making $3,600 a year, which he thought was pretty good, but his goal was to make $5,000 a year, the magic figure that somehow spelled financial success to him. One day he heard of a good job opening in his line of work. It paid $10,000 a year. He felt he should take action on this opportunity, but something was holding him back. He spoke to his father about it. His father advised him as follows: if the company is as good as your present company and you think you can handle the job, then go ahead and get it. The young man began to make excuses, but they didn't ring true to his father, who told him, I think $10,000 a year seems so big to you, it scares the daylights out of you. His father was right. He never went after that job. The young fellow couldn't think of himself as if he were a $10,000 man. Here's where the technique comes in. We can jolt ourselves out of the prison that limits the size of our thinking. By using this 10 times technique, we can break free from the squirrel cage in which our little aims run round and round. Get out into the fresh air, dramatically increase the size of the projects we are able to embrace, discover as if by magic, electric new means for the realization of these bigger goals. Just use this technique. Tell yourself that you must operate on 10 times the scale that you are now operating, or that you must do something 10 times as well as you're now doing it. This as-if concept will smash through the ceiling that limits the size of your thinking. Sometimes this process is forced on us from the outside, and then we don't have to imagine it, as in the exciting example that follows. The young man who was shocked by his company president. One morning when John, a young $10,000 corporate executive, arrived at his office, his secretary told him Mr. Wells would like to see you in his office at 10 this morning. Mr. Wells was the president of the company, and he never sent for minor executives. John wondered what was up. He felt uneasy. He assumed that something must be wrong. He hoped he was in for just a bawling out, but that thought maybe he was going to be fired as part of the company's austerity program. That would be austerity for me, all right, he observed wryly. In the hour he had before he was due in the president's office, he reassured himself, or tried to. He had done a pretty good job with his department. Profits had gone up about 10% each year. For the 2 years he had been running the department, he hadn't set the world on fire, but he had shown that he was no slouch. He felt better after having given himself the line of reinsurance, and with his department's latest profit and loss statement in his hand, he headed upstairs. As soon as he came into the president's office, the big boss said to him, I think you have some very good stuff in you, John, but your department is showing a profit of only 100,000 a year. So that was it. He felt better. He could vindicate himself here. Yes, Mr. Wells, but that's up about 10% from last year, isn't it? Mr. Wells didn't answer. He just paused for a few seconds as though he were setting the stage for something, and then came the haymaker. In the next 2 years, I want you to try to step up profits in your department to $1 million a year. John thought perhaps he had heard the big boss wrong. He swallowed hard. Did you say $1 million, sir? Yes, $1 million. But that's 10 times what I'm doing. You're not joking with me, sir? He asked hopefully. No, I'm certainly not joking. I want you to try it, and with the same people you now have. When you show $1 million in profits, your salary will be increased to $25,000 a year. John was silent for a moment, trying to pull himself together, trying to get his bearings. I'll do what I can, Mr. Wells. I hope you don't mind my saying so, but I'm flabbergasted. This comes as a great surprise to me. It's given me a terrific jolt. Mr. Wells permitted himself a little inward smile. He had gotten just the response he was after. He knew that John was an able person using a fraction of his real potential. He knew that the thing he and nearly everyone else needs is just such a terrific jolt, something strong enough to free their thinking from the little cage in which it is trapped. John had gotten a jolt, all right, but it was a happy jolt. He was all agog at the possibility of making $25,000 a year. When you're making $10,000 a year, $25,000 seems like paradise. And he wanted very much to please Mr. Wells, whom he liked and admired. Two powerful emotions had entered the picture to break things wide open: the chance for financial gain and the desire for approval. But de Stael says it's the emotions that make us think, and it's the emotions that make us think big. John breaks through his ceiling. By the time John got back to his desk, he was a new man moving in a new world. For the first time in his life, he felt that he was really alive. For the first time, he felt an exhilarating flow of energy that seemed to carry him along and make everything easy. He reappraised everything he was doing, gave everything an electric going over. He'd have to find some radically new way to operate, totally different from his present method. He had been shocked out of his unusual way of life. He started to act big, to match the new vision that Mr. Wells' explosive action had planted in his mind. His department made its money selling $5 books by mail. He'd keep this flywheel going, of course, and try to rev it up, but his mind began to race over new territory. Under the powerful stimulus of his new vision, he jotted down a dozen ideas that thinking big had set ablazing in his mind. He'd now sell 1,000 to 10,000 copies of a book at a clip to larger corporations. He'd branch out from his book business and add art prints to his line. He'd bring out a $300 culture library. He'd climb aboard the home study course boom, one of the fastest growing businesses in America. His imagination was flashing off ideas. His judgment had a new razor-like edge. But the biggest change of all in John was his sudden transformation from executive to leader. His new fire spread rapidly to everyone around him. He now had something to fight for, something he wanted intensely. And this wanting something intensely is the essence of leadership, the thing that enables one person to set others on fire. Business is begging for this quality today. Some life needs it. It's the heart of politics. All organization work, and the quickest way to achieve this quality is to break through to thinking big. In a matter of hours, John and his department were functioning at a whole new tempo. One of the most interesting points of this awakening was the way he used on his own advertising copywriters the technique Mr. Wells had used on him. He told them no longer to try for quota, but to write as if they had to make 10 times quota. They smiled when they heard it, but the stepped-up copy some of them started to turn out showed the dynamic power in this 10 times technique. This works on engineers too. An engineer had this same thing pulled on him in a slightly different way. His company was marketing a piece of equipment that retails for $10 and is used in almost every building in the country. The market is enormous, but the competition is tough. One day the boss asked him to try to figure out some way that would enable them to sell the $10 product for $1. The engineer gave the boss a quick look to see if he had been drinking. He looked sober enough, even though he didn't sound it. The engineer protested indignantly, "But you simply can't sell anything like that for $1. Right? You can't. But I didn't say it would have to be anything like that. My guess is that it will have to be something very unlike our present product." The engineer had to stand way back from the operation and try to see the whole thing in a new perspective. His whole approach changed. He started thinking all over again from the ground up. Within 3 weeks, he came through with a whole new idea based on a totally different principle, something so different, so simple, they could market it for $5 at a good profit and practically take over the field. This technique of as if 10 times the size, or in this case, as if 1/10 the cost, magically breaks us free from the cage of habits in which our thoughts go round and round. We try too often to modify things to improve them, which is all right as far as it goes. But what we sometimes need to do is blast ourselves into a whole new approach, and this as if 10 times technique is the very thing that can do it, and it increases your energies and capacities. This technique not only blasts us into new thinking, but equally important, it enormously increases our capacities, our energies. Here is one of the greatest of all psychological miracles. When we force ourselves into big thinking, when we envision new plans and king-sized goals, the inner self automatically tries to up your output, to supply what it takes to put across these big new plans. It automatically tries to supply the increased capacity to match your daring new vision. Psychologists have been telling us for years how this mechanism works on the physical level. They have given us a very simple illustration of this mechanism in action, something which everyone has experienced. Here it is. When you reach out to lift something that you think is going to be heavy, and it turns out to be light, the thing goes shooting up into the air. Why? Because you thought you had to lift something heavy, and thus you were ready to lift something heavy. We automatically try to put forth the degree of strength we think a task requires. For example, suppose you're going to lift a 5-gallon can of gasoline. You know what it weighs, you've lifted them before, actually it's 35 pounds. Without thinking about it, your mind thinks 35 pounds. It dials 35 pounds to your muscles and nerves. We never think of this mechanism unless we get fooled by the can being empty. Then it weighs less than 1/10 as much, and the 3-pound empty can goes sailing up over our head with a 35-pound tug. No matter what we think a task requires, we automatically try to respond with the force necessary to take care of it. When we break through to new big thinking, when we entertain big new goals, envision things in a whole new dimension, and hold that dimension before us, our energies and capacities are automatically stepped up to meet the increased demand. Anyone can use this as if 10 times technique anywhere. You can use this technique anywhere to multiply your power. You can use it in your business, you can use it in charity work, in social goings-on, in church work, and you can use it at home. It takes no special equipment. You can turn it on in a matter of minutes. Just imagine that you're faced with the necessity of making one of your operations 10 times as big, or 10 times as successful, or 10 times as good as it is. This as-if technique can bring a whole new dimension into any area of your life. For example, I use this technique in working on this book. When I began to write this book, I was naturally interested in how large a sale it would have. I knew from experience that books of this kind usually sell around 10,000 copies, and I had been thinking in terms of 10,000 copies. Well, why shouldn't I use this thinking big technique on the book? Why shouldn't I think in terms of 100,000 copies instead of 10,000 copies? Why not multiply the operation by 10? I imagined I was under the necessity of writing not just a better book than I had planned, but something 10 times as good. One that would warrant a sale of 100,000 copies. I reminded myself I was writing this book to do people some good, and that it would be better to do good to 100,000 people than to 10,000. I recalled how much a book would have helped me when I was a young man, and I wanted to give my son and young people like him the advantage of my experiences. I spent an evening getting myself into thinking big about the book, drumming up the emotions that would incite me to break through to big thinking about it. Suddenly the whole thing came through with a roar, breaking me from the too small pattern in which my thinking about the book had been trapped. I had known from the start that my general idea for the book was good. The idea was this: to explain a dozen principles that step up a person's effectiveness. Things that I know from experience work. This shaped up nicely and I was satisfied with it, but now that I was using this 10 times technique, my stance toward the whole project changed. I decided that this wasn't going to be just another book, but something very special. Under the electric charge of this as-if technique, the pulse speed of the whole project stepped up. A dozen ideas for making the book a better book came to me with rapid-fire speed. Now the book would not only deal with specific actions, but would feature those actions in a striking new way. To begin with, I'd set the book up not as a chapter 1, chapter 2, but action 1, action 2. Each chapter action would start right off with one sentence statement of the purpose of the action to be taken, and be followed by a one sentence description of the action itself. My thinking big about the book gave the whole project new pace and power and improved it in a dozen ways. I decided to supply at the end of each action the forms the reader needs to make the taking of these actions virtually automatic. I called these vital pages at the end of each chapter the business end of the chapter. They became the feature of the book. Thanks to this as-if technique I had used on myself, I came up with a book that was 10 times as valuable to anyone who used it. When the editor read the manuscript, he told me it was one of the most exciting self-help books he had ever seen. Why this technique is such a bombshell? This technique is a terrific bombshell because it brings into play the great psychological principle of as-if. In this case, we get the mind to respond as if it faced an ultimatum, as if it faced an or else. Either you steep things up to 10 times the scale or do something 10 times as well or else. You may say this is nothing but a trick, that all we are doing is kidding the mind into believing it must do something that it really need not do. Of course, it's a trick, but when used rightly, it works. We must remember that the forces which limit the size of our thinking are in a sense artificial too. They are not necessarily inherent in our makeups or in our environment. We can overcome these artificial limitations with a contrived technique of our own. Are you a trailblazer? The great advantage of this technique is that it permits you to break out of a squirrel cage. Thinking frees you to think fresh new thoughts, take dramatic new approaches. This is a quality that makes a person lead instead of follow. My father understood men, and he knew how rare originality is. He knew how quick people are to imitate any spark of originality in others. One of his favorite sayings was, "It's easy enough to do a thing after somebody else has done it." But the big prizes in life, and more important, the creative satisfactions, go to the person who can initiate, who can lead the way into fresh thinking. And this technique is invaluable for enabling you to do just that. Warning, this is strong medicine. It will jolt you into a dynamic new life, will lead you into superlative achievements. But there are a couple of things you better keep in mind. 1, don't count on this technique alone to carry the whole load. Don't just sit around thinking big. Using this technique doesn't mean that you can neglect the solid techniques in other chapters. For example, you must use this electric technique on top of the actions outlined for starting off from your here and now, for doing your best with things as they are. 2, and you must not junk your current operations. Remember that whatever you are doing is carrying us. Our current activities are the flywheel of our existence. We must keep things going. If we are selling shoelaces for a living, we must continue to sell shoelaces while we are moving over into thinking big and acting big. The false objection to bigness. There is a cult today against bigness of any kind. Some of this is a pose, a kind of vanity in reverse, pure pretension, and pure horse feathers. But some of it is real. Bigness in itself is not a virtue. To make a thing bigger is not to make it better. There is an optimum size for everything, whether it be vegetables, a house, or a business operation. To go beyond that size is to run into a diminishing return in satisfaction, in efficiency, or in profit, or in all three. But the optimum size is usually much larger than we in our squirrel cage thinking are able to envision. And very often, it is not simply a question of the optimum size for a given project, but of changing and adding to the operation, making it a different project where the optimum size is many times larger. Forms for the dynamic application of this technique are supplied in pages that follow. Hints for using the as-if technique for big thinking. 1. Imagine that you're faced with making one of your operations 10 times as successful, or 10 times its current size, or with becoming 10 times as good at something. 2. The purpose of this technique is to enable you to break free from habitual squirrel cage thinking, to enable you to take a fresh look at what you're doing, to take a dynamic new approach. 3. Most of our thinking is modification and improvement of what you're doing, which is okay. But we often need radical new thinking, a whole new approach. 4. This technique not only breaks you free for big new thinking, but by enabling you to envision big new goals, your capacity and energy are thus increased. 5. Don't go off the deep end and just sit around thinking big. This technique is to be used on top of our regular flywheel activities, and along with the rest of the techniques. 6. You can use it anywhere. A housewife can use it to become 10 times as good a cook. A real estate man can use it to skyrocket his income from $5,000 to $50,000 a year. An executive can use it to make judgments virtually infallible. Remember, the optimum size of a project is often much larger than we think of it, whether it is our salary or our business or any project, whatever. My as-if for breaking into big thinking. I'm going to imagine I'm faced with the necessity of making $50,000 a year and act accordingly. This man spent an hour getting this as-if across to himself, his first big step. Just thinking of himself as a $50,000 a year man changed his whole stance toward himself and his business. His life lit up like a neon sign when he put this as-if across. Here are some of the dramatic new actions I'm going to take. 1. To call attention to my business, I'll paint my little building electric yellow and jet black. This will look pretty startling, but it will be the eye center of town. 2. To call attention to myself, I'll volunteer to be the speaker at the next meeting of the Businessman's Luncheon Club. I'll give a talk on how to wake up your business and how I'm waking up mine. 3. I've heard of an incentive system for salesmen worked out by a California broker that's sending profits through the roof. It's so hot for salesmen, it set the office on fire. I'll adopt it. 4. I'll have to find some big new deals in business property, and I'll have to know something about the tax angles involved. I'll bone up on federal tax angles. 5. I'll make my office an investment center, show people how they can get 3 times the income from real estate as from other investments. 6. I'll get out a little newspaper dramatizing the properties I have for sale. 7. I'll get myself and my men to work up swapping deals. This is big stuff now. Instead of one sale, you get 2, 3, or 4 at a clip. And 8, I'll go in looking for a little success, make a point of being well-groomed and well-dressed. This 10 times technique is terrific for revving up your life, breaking it wide open. Try it in some area. See how big thinking transforms your life. You can use this technique to skyrocket your income, to become 10 times as good at your job, to become a savant in any field, to become a terrific cook, to greatly improve your appearance, to achieve power and prestige. It doesn't matter what the field is. This as-if works. Once you put the as-if over, once you break through to big thinking, things begin to happen inside you. You'll fill in the spaces with exciting new ideas for achieving newer, bigger visions. You'll find yourself teeming with new energy to achieve your bigger dreams. So get out a piece of paper right now and write on it the date and say, I'm going to break through the ceiling that limits the size of my thinking on the top. To achieve this, I'm going to imagine that I must multiply by 10 and then fill your goal out on the line. So if particular, you are making $100,000 and you would then say, my goal is $1 million. Or if your goal is $200,000, then change your goal to $2 million. Multiply it by 10. And then write down, here are some of the actions I'm going to take, and write down 8 to 10 things that you can take that would put you into that 10 times mindset. That is the secret. So we are always limited, even in the goals that we set. Somebody says, I need to make $10,000, and they could actually make $100,000 if they simply set the goal for that. Now, this book is using very small numbers because in 1963, when it was published, people didn't make as much money. But the thought still stays. Whatever it is that you are setting for your goal right now, I want you to really look at it. Maybe your goal is $1 million. Why not change that to 10 million? Whatever it is, let it be the incentive that you need to push you to create new ideas, to create new things, to change your habits and behavior so that you can reach that 10x goal. It's helped me immensely. One time my goal was to make $100,000, and I made that my goal when I could have changed it to $1 million. And by staying in the $100,000 range, I was living a $100,000 life in my imagination. I needed to start living the $1 million life in my imagination and to think bigger. It invites new thought streams, new ideas, and your prosperity is maximized, and you have great potentials for it. You can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com, and I'm imagining 10 times the views for this episode and 10 times the love being sent to you than I normally send, and I'm imagining 10 times the success for you in everything that you do. And welcome to The Reality Revolution.